Yeah, no, definitely. I think like I'm like you. Like I see because I think we end up seeing people that have been through a lot of processes and they're really frustrated and they are restricting their diet. And some people it will be as simple as they just weren't aware of how many calories in some, and they
Mm.
need of education and that sort of thing, and that it was an excessive intake that was causing the energy balance issue. But some people, I'm with you on this, that there are people that they're either amazing liars and they are just their whole life is trying to create a story that you know um, gives them a reason to like not be able to change or whatever it is. And I just don't think that's the case because they're very frustrated with the situation. So I think you then have to look at what things might be affecting energy balance, like you're saying. So with that, I mean, obviously you're starting to rule out things like whether there's any thyroid dysfunction, and I think that has to be a real thing to sort of look at because that's going to impact our ability to metabolize energy or the rate at which we're metabolizing energy. There's an interesting theme with kind of like metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, in the sense that oxidative stress is a big part of that picture. And I think whenever we've got like this kind of increased level of oxidative stress, our mitochondria are not able to function quite at the rate, at the state of what they should be able to. So, looking at how the mitochondria function and how well we're able to make energy, I think is also another part of the picture as well. And if we've got this high level of oxidative stress or poor antioxidant status, I think that can certainly play a little bit of a role. Now, interestingly, with kind of type 2 diabetes, and this is actually probably not quite with that population, but that excessive amount of food coming in and energy coming in, and the spin off of us having to process that energy creates quite a lot of oxidative stress, which can make the cell a little bit more resistant anyway. But certainly, I think with those populations that are kind of frustrated, they seem to be, you know, eating very like few calories or a level of calories you would be expecting to see results, then I would be wanting to look at kind of like metabolic reasons at which that might not be occurring. Are there ways in which we can improve energy metabolism that actually allow them to be able to utilize energy a little bit more? And maybe that creates a bit of an improvement. Unfortunately, I think with those people, it's rarely a case of type 2 diabetes that's causing them a problem, to be honest with you. I think there's other things kind of going on. Like that, I guess what I'm saying is they very rarely present with pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and this very kind of like low calorie sort of state. They typically have other metabolic symptoms going on at the same time. I don't know whether you kind of see that. I think more the type 2 diabetes and that sort of thing, there's probably more of an argument of excessive food intake and inadequate exercise. On that point, I think the exercise is crucial because that ability to train and to increase the levels of mitochondria, actually, that is probably one of the most important things from an energy balance point of view and from a type 2 diabetes point of view, is just getting people moving again and just getting people able to utilize energy and clear what is stored up in things like their muscle tissue so that when they are actually bringing more glucose back into the cell, that it's actually able to go into glycogen storage, or it's actually able to be used to make ATP instead, rather than being pushed through these pathways to just increase levels of fat within the cell. So that's why I think it's always interesting, as complex as we go with this, the food and the movement are probably two of the most important things. And I think with some people, it's actually focusing on the movement a lot more to try and increase muscle tissue levels and mitochondrial levels instead. And focusing on that can sometimes give a much better result than just focusing on diet alone.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I definitely see I think a little bit of a theme whereby people, and it's not even just, I guess, in my clinic, but in society to a degree, there's a real focus on nutrition these days. And sometimes to, I think, an unhealthy level. And
Yeah,
there isn't as much attention put on every other aspect of health, and exercise being a really good example, I think.
yeah,
And I don't know if it's because it's easier to kind of control our diet and what we're kind of consuming compared to how we kind of move and exercise. But there's definitely, I think, a need to really kind of push some of these other aspects of what a healthy body, spirit, mind actually needs.
Yeah, definitely. And like, like I think way before I got into functional medicine, I'd done a lot of stuff with Paul Chek, who I don't know,
Yeah.
some stuff. So I done a lot of stuff with him, and like his sort of approach was always kind of like looking at sleep, looking at stress, looking at. So it was very much the foundations, I think, of functional medicine before it kind of got sexy,
Yeah.
sense. And I think that was and I'd always bought into that fact. And I think even when you look at kind of glucose regulation and type 2 diabetes, if you take sleep just as an example, it's like if you put someone into a sleep deprived state, I can't remember what the study was, but it was like either 3 days or 5 days of 4 hours or 6 hours of less of sleep creates insulin resistance. So it's like you can't not look at someone's sleep if you've got someone that has got type 2 diabetes, because if they're sleeping 4 hours a night and chronically sleeping 4 hours a night, you can be doing a lot of really good stuff with their food, and you might be doing a lot of good stuff with their movement. But if they're sleep deprived, that in itself is going to create insulin resistance. And secondary to that, if they're sleep deprived, they're probably going to want to eat more food that kind of gives them a pick me up. They're probably not going to want to do their exercise as well. So all of these things are kind of physiologically connected, but also one thing can kind of make another thing a lot harder to follow as well at the same time. So I think there always has to be an emphasis on kind of looking at all these different areas. Like in the realms of like stress is a really good one, because and I think we touched on this earlier, but you've basically got insulin's the main hormone that's going to bring your blood sugar levels down. Then we have 4 hormones that essentially help bring the blood sugar levels up and maintain our blood sugar. So we've got growth hormone, we've got glucagon, and then we've got cortisol and adrenaline as well. Now, what cortisol and adrenaline, obviously, we can stimulate those through stress. People will notice as well, like when they exercise, they'll get an increase in their sugar levels because we're going to stimulate adrenaline, cortisol. That's a perfectly normal response because the body's trying to free up glycogen from the liver to deliver to the musculoskeletal tissue, to the muscle tissue, so that you can fight or you can run or you can do whatever kind of exercise you're doing. But interestingly as well, you can get people that are on kind of chronic levels of or dosages of like glucocorticoid steroids, and because of the cortisone-based medication, that in itself can create this kind of increase or production of glucose. So again, we're talking about, is this a clearance issue or is this a production issue? And sometimes it's not always about it being a clearance issue. Sometimes it's adrenaline, cortisol, glucagon, because those are not being suppressed as they should do. They're actually increasing and causing the blood sugar levels to go up. And then our body's having to basically process this glucose and deal with it, which then in itself can maybe lead to more fat accumulation in the muscle tissue, more oxidative stress within the cell, like those sorts of things. So that's why I'd say it's like, we have to look at, clearance or production or combinations of the two being part of the picture.
Mm. And I think all of this reiterates a frequent conversational theme in these episodes, which is, to a large degree, I think if we are really focusing on these fundamentals, so we're getting appropriate movement in, sleep is appropriate, the diet is appropriate, we're reducing enough stresses and strain on the system that actually we are going to get a significant improvement more times than not, certainly. And I know in my past, I think sometimes we resist that concept because we almost want it to be more complicated.
Yeah.
I think, we want it to be harder for ourselves because maybe does it give us an excuse to not make the changes? So I think there's probably a behavioral thing there as well.
100%. I think that's definitely it. And I think almost when people are coming in to consult with me is they're almost wanting to look for the next test, or they're wanting to look for the next supplement that's going to give them some sort of mechanistic reason as to, what is going on, and there's a specific thing that's kind of causing it. And actually, the more I do this, the less testing I do, and the more I'm sort of like focusing on the fundamentals. And I kind of, with the clients, I'll sort of do sleep, eat, move, breathe, repeat. So they're kind of like the things that we do. Like the repeat is much more the kind of behavioral change aspect of it. but the sleep, eat, move, breathe, because the repeat is so important, is that ability to be able to make changes, but make sustainable changes that over a long enough period of time, we're going to start to see these physiological changes. And that, whilst, it's not that I think testing shouldn't be used or anything like that. I think we have that ability now to be able to look at the physiology in a much more in-depth fashion. But I think there is a tendency towards over-testing 100%, that sometimes before the basics are put in place, people are going through this process of looking at deep physiological pathways when actually they need to address their sleep, or they need to look at energy balance, or they need to look at their movement or relaxation, and working on their lifestyle and their crappy relationship at home, and all of those sorts of things which actually are creating these physiological imbalances anyway. So I think there always needs to be more emphasis kind of put onto a lot of these fundamental basics, like what we've spoken about with insulin and glucose. Like, doesn't matter how you cut it, you're still going to come back to the basics. Like, we're still talking about clearance, and we're still talking about production. Even if it is more of a clearance or production issue, we still come back to the same fundamental things, which are, we need to get you moving. We need to look at energy balance. We've got to start getting your relaxation levels down. Maybe the other levels to that are, we need to find if there are any things underlying that might be a chronic infection or inflammatory issue that then might be causing a chronic stress within your body as well. That then becomes I think that bolts onto it quite nicely. And I think this is where it always does tend to come a little bit down to back to the gut as well. With that, is that a lot of those kind of underlying chronic inflammatory sort of issues, or chronic infections or whatever, or dysbiosis or whatever it might be, it's almost an additional foundational thing to sort of plug into it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I wanted us to actually to touch more on the guts in this sort of topic, really, because I think it is a key one, even when we're talking about blood sugar control and metabolic health. I know I've certainly had clients whereby they're type 2 diabetic on meds, and they are eating fine. It's certainly not a dietary thing which is driving their poor health. And we've done maybe some GI testing, doing a stool test or something. We've supported the digestive system. And I have at least one client I can think of where it was a little bit, test protocol, so to speak, in inverted commas, fix. But for him, I mean, he had something like a 75% reduction in his medication over a 3-4 month period. And we weren't doing anything from a calorie intake or an exercise perspective. Those things were pretty sound. Yeah. But he did have quite significant digestive imbalances. And again, we've touched on one mechanism with this LPS breakdown product that we know is very inflammatory and immunogenic when it crosses a leaky gut lining. But the question that I wanted to ask you was around the microbiome generally. So obviously it's quite a big thing in social media and in articles these days about how our gut bacteria can influence obesity risks and things like this. So is that something that stands up in the actual research?
Yeah, I mean, I remember I can't remember what it was. I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago or so. There was a group out of Israel that were basically looking at the microbiome, and they were looking at glycemic response to food. And they were showing that different microbiomes mean that you respond differently to different foods. So essentially the glycemic low, glycemic index is actually very unique and individual to one's microbiome.
Right.
So I think they were trying to sort of create a algorithm to basically kind of go, well, with this type of microbiome, then you might want to eat it. So it's like a test, and then seeing what type of foods are going to have less of a glycemic response.
Yeah.
Even just that, just kind of going, well, actually, the bugs in our gut are influencing what the level of sugar is going to go up in the blood. And I think mechanistically that might be also related to things like your incretins hormones as well, like GLP-1 and GIP and that sort of thing as well. But I think there is a direct influence of gut on kind of blood sugar stabilization as well, for sure.
Yeah, and I think the other kind of big thing out there is the whole kind of Firmicutes bacteroidetes, if I pronounced that correctly. And I think sort of a higher ratio leaning towards the firmicutes has kind of been associated as maybe with an obese phenotype, as it were.
Yeah, so I think, then you're looking at kind of the gut and how it's influencing energy balance. So a little
Mm.
talking about like what things might influence energy balance in certain individuals. And also like from the point of view with certain bacteria, is there less of an absorption of glucose? Like certainly if you look at, some mechanisms of trying to be able to manage glucose is reduced absorption of glucose from the gut. And you can use certain fibers like glucagon and that sort of thing to actually just reduce the amount of glucose that's coming in. Like mechanistically, could it be that, certain microbiomes and certain bacteria will influence actually how much you absorb of certain nutrients, glucose or fats or whatever it might be? So there's always going to be, we have our nice little equations where we type in our height and our weight and it kicks out our BMI and sorry, not our BMI, our basal metabolic rate and that sort of stuff. But I think there's always going to be so much change from one person to another with the same stats. And then also, to be honest with you, from 1 month to another, like depending on, what your diet and lifestyle is and how that's influencing your microbiome and therefore then how that's maybe influencing energy balance as well.
Yeah, and go back to what you mentioned about sleep, I guess, as well. And in a matter of 3 days, we can have a massive shift in how we're regulating blood glucose. And I think
Yeah.
also some of those studies have shown changes in the hormones that regulate appetite. So, like you say, we probably are going to be wanting to eat a little bit more during those times as well.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Anecdotal evidence from my kind of health journey is I was very much in the paleo camp, especially in my, I guess, young mid-20s. And I really did struggle with carbohydrates from a health, cognitive energy sort of perspective. And I definitely had some reactive hypoglycaemia symptoms, whatever the mechanism was now. But I have found, my fiance is vegetarian, and I now certainly eat a little bit more, probably significantly more vegetarian. I've tried different probiotics more recently. I've been using prebiotics a lot more for the first time in a long time as well. And I just feel the way I respond is very different. And
Yeah.
I do think, and again, this is very anecdotal and it could be way off, but I do think there's a connection between when I started eating a bit more vegetarian and started taking prebiotics daily and how I was responding to different meals with, macronutrient split. So higher carbohydrate, lower protein and fat sometimes, and just feeling I tolerated it a lot better using, subjective markers like my cognition over the next few hours and things like this. So I do think the gut is again essential component to all of this still, and it sounds like you're in agreement to an extent, but we still go back to all the basics. Sometimes I think we always need to take that step back. It's fun to have the geeky conversations, and sometimes clients love it as well. But then we've got to really rein it in, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, no, exactly. And sometimes, the geeky conversations allow us to, or the ability to observe and find out where the dysfunction is going on, allow us to fine tune the protocol a little bit more. So like in the case of kind of like reactive hypoglycemic sort of tendencies, then actually what we might be wanting to do with those sorts of people is we do adjust the diet to be able to reduce the amount of GLP-1 that's being secreted. Or likewise, if we're trying to increase GLP-1 in those people that are struggling to sort of get that first phase insulin response, and actually looking at things like pea protein or EPA and DHA or bile acid stimulation or berberine or those sorts of things that actually we can mechanistically go, this looks like this is your picture, therefore the protocol is going to be like this. Whereas if it's someone that's maybe got some mitochondrial dysfunction, then you might be going more, you might be treating, you probably shouldn't say treating, you might be trying to support someone who's got like kind of metabolic syndrome, but you might be doing it from a mitochondrial point of view. And actually for that person, yes, you might be doing all the basics, but they might also need support with CoQ10, alpha lipoic acid, carnitine, vitamin E, like magnesium, those sorts of things to try and improve those pathways a little bit. And likewise, if it's more of a actual insulin production or insulin sensitivity thing, then of course you've got, things like banana leaf, your chromium, your cinnamon, like bilberry, like those types of things that you can sort of like utilize as well. So it's kind of, I think, because I think what happens a lot of the time is we look at things like insulin and type 2 diabetes, especially, as there being only one cause with it. And to some degree, it's an energy balance issue, and that to some degree is true, and focusing on the basics is right. But within that as well, there are ways in which we can support someone to get better results, or to be able to, I guess, to just improve the results that we're able to get with them. Because what you don't want is for them to make these really big changes with nutrition and lifestyle, and then for them to be quite frustrated with the speed at which they're getting results as well. So we can fine tune and improve the type of results that we're going to be able to get with them. Like, there's a really interesting one with, so we talked a lot about production and clearance. And if you're thinking about glucagon being elevated and being one of the main drivers behind the increase in glucose, is what can we actually do to be able to get that down? One mechanism is to try and stimulate GLP-1 to try and get that first phase insulin response. Another one is to actually look at using GABA, and GABA with meals, because GABA has the ability to block glucagon production from the pancreas. So there's an interesting way then potentially of actually using something like GABA to be able to reduce the production of glucagon, so we get that production down a little bit. There's really interesting studies. I think they've done these only on mice for obvious reasons when I tell you, where they basically induced type 1 diabetes. And in one study, they basically had, They had glucagon receptor knockout mice. So they basically took away the receptors for glucagon, so they were unable to act upon the cell. And then they obviously had a control group. So basically, they induced type 1 diabetes. They inject them with some weird substance which is able to do that. And the mice that hadn't had the glucagon receptors knocked out, like, died pretty quickly. The ones that had the glucagon receptors knocked out survived, because actually they're not continually producing glucose, and they survived for weeks on end after the original study. Wow. So that was kind of like one mechanism. Another one that they did is they bathed mice in like high doses of GABA, and then type 2 diabetes. And the ones that were bathed in high doses of GABA were able to survive much longer as well. So there's this kind of, even looking at type 2 diabetes, there's mechanisms of which, maybe a lot of it is to do with this continuous production of glucagon. Because insulin is a suppressor of glucagon, then when you lose that production of insulin, glucagon's able to just kind of freely be produced. And it's that release then of glucose continuously from the liver into the bloodstream that then causes this just continuous elevation of glucose as it goes up. So there's kind of, it's geeky stuff, but it's also, it gives us the ability to like fine tune protocols and be able to support people to a completely different level, I think. Right.
Yeah. And I think, maybe, obviously we can start with the fundamentals, but at some point you're going to have a client where actually all this stuff becomes 100% applicable, and if you don't know it, then we get stuck.
Yeah.
Do you, or have you ever used or have experience clinically with some of these monitors, sort of almost 24/7 blood glucose monitors?
Yeah. So I've got a doctor that I actually work with at the moment. She's got type 2 diabetes. She lives in India, but we're working together. So she has one, which she uses, and it seems to be okay. But I have had one client that was using it, and the validity of the results, I think, are questionable, because she had one on for 14 days, and I think you have to change it every 2 weeks. And then she put the next one on, and she was consistently reading 1 point above what she was before. And so she was going through a process of kind of testing food and seeing how she was responding to different food. And then suddenly it was like every single food that she was having, she was, more insulin resistant to, or having a higher glycemic kind of like effect from. So I emailed the company and asked them about, is there any kind of like data showing your machine versus like real time like blood measurements to show the validity, but I didn't get any data back, so I'm not too sure about. I'm, maybe it was a one-off device that was faulty. And my other client that is using one at the moment in India, that seems to be working really well for us, and we're seeing. I think it's a really cool tool, but I'm just not too sure on the validity of it yet. I'm just not sure whether what it is saying is actually what is going on. So, if a client chooses to do it, I'm kind of like, cool, let's just see what it's like. But if the results are a bit funny, get a glucometer and just test yourself with a glucometer at the same time to see whether it's reading what it should be reading. So that's how I've kind of played it at the moment.
Okay. So when we talk about the glucometer, are we essentially talking about, self blood prick testing?
Yeah, exactly. So if someone's like, if they've got one of the patches on and we're just not sure about it, get them to get that, and then just to do like real time measurements of that, and then just to see if there's a correlation with the device that they've got on. That's been the only way I can try and sort of bring some sort of validity and testing to those things. But I mean, they're becoming quite widely used now, and I know there's a lot of kind of like doctors and that sort of thing that are kind of using them and recommending them. So I mean, I'm assuming that they've been through some level of kind of like testing and validity screening or whatever, but I've got no idea.
Okay. Yeah, I had a client who mentioned something along the lines of the one you were talking of, which is kind of, I could describe it as the plaster on your arm that you scan. I think it's used a lot in the US in quite conventional settings, and I think they're trying to get it more NHS operated here, from what he said. But obviously it is very convenient, and it's, I think, becoming quite popular. So I was curious if you'd had any experience there, because going back to what you mentioned about the whole GL index, so how we as an individual respond to foods being very personal, I think those sorts of tools for people who do want to kind of take their health to that level are going to be a real game changer for us.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I think the concept and the idea is amazing. And like, I think if they can get it right, and if it is valid and it's sound and it seems to be working, then I think for those people that do want to take on that level of responsibility and understanding of how they're responding to foods, and then to be able to make sort of like little tweaks and changes, I think it's an amazing tool, because the last thing you want to be doing is pricking your finger, like continuously through different points of the day. And also if you're just wanting to see how you're responding to food, because it gives you a nice little graph like as well. So it's like real time measurements, and you're getting the kind of, up and down. Obviously if you're finger pricking, you're getting just that point of what it is, and you're having to plot your own sort of graph with that all the way through. Right. The real time graph that you get, and what we've been using with the doctor that I'm working with in India, is we're essentially just looking at her average, and we're watching her average come down. We're watching the peaks start to drop, and we're seeing the average blood glucose in terms of her graph starting to come back down into the normal sort of range. And it kind of gives you a real-time HbA1c as well. So you can get like, this is your HbA1c for the last 2 weeks based upon your blood level. So that's kind of nice as well, because obviously you're not just relying upon that 3-month sort of window. It's like, over the last 2 weeks, this is what it's been over this 2 weeks. So we saw with her in 2 weeks, I mean, her HbA1c was 10 point something or another.
Wow.
So in 2 weeks is 8.6. So we're seeing quite a significant improvement just in 2 weeks. But because, obviously if we rerun our HbA1c now, it wouldn't be 8.6. It would probably be 9 point something, because we need that life cycle of the red blood cell to get that accurate picture of that 3-month window. But with the machine, we get, over the last 2 weeks, it has actually dropped.
Okay, gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I've been tempted for a good few weeks to get one of these devices just to play around with it. I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I might have to do an update at some point. Okay, brilliant. Is there anything, Steve, that you want to cover that we haven't yet covered, or anything that you feel you just need to, I guess, conclude on or summarize?
Yeah, I guess the main things is just kind of trying to keep things as simple as possible when we're looking at stuff. Like if someone's got kind of insulin resistance going on, then looking at what the potential main causes might be, whether it's like an intake or movement issue, so a basic sort of energy balance thing being probably one of the most important things to look at, whether there is increased levels of stress or whether there are any kind of like cortisol based medications that might be influencing blood sugar that way. Um, are there any kind of like signs of inflammation or infection or oxidative stress in any way that might actually be influencing things a little bit, looking for infection, other symptoms going on elsewhere in the body that might be kind of part of that picture. So I think kind of, from an insulin resistance type 2 diabetes point of view is just kind of, look at the fundamentals first, look at the movement, the sleep, sleep, eat, move, breathe, repeat, like look at those sort of areas first. Then your next layer is kind of, infection, inflammation, like those sorts of things, and starting to look at that. Maybe your next layers on from that are kind of mitochondrial issues, oxidative stress, like starting to look at those sorts of things if you're not getting results with the other things. So
Right.
sort of starting with those basics first, and then you're filtering in whether you need to go to that level of investigating for underlying causes of inflammation or infection, or underlying causes of mitochondrial dysfunction or thyroid dysfunction or whatever it might be. But I think they're the kind of main areas from an insulin resistance kind of metabolic syndrome sort of point of view. I think that realm of like glucose management, which actually affects probably most people, is and this kind of how we manage blood sugar and those peaks and those lows or those potential issues with stimulating the counter-regulatory hormones that keep our blood sugar level. This again is now much more to do with what was your meal like what was your meal like before? Does it need to be more balanced? Do you need to look at the basics of macronutrient ratios, that sort of thing in your meal to then see how that influences your glucose regulation as well? Is fasting right for you, or do you need to work towards being able to do some fasting? And a lot of the time, I think most people can fast, but like what you were saying earlier, there are populations of people that increased kind of level of, shall we say, stress on the body when they're already fragile, shall we say, might be something that's not necessarily going to be right for them to do. So, yeah, I guess they're kind of like the key things. And I guess the other thing that I think is really important is before we give anyone any kind of like insulin sensitizing or insulin stimulating agent, we need to start thinking about the mechanisms underneath that might be causing the body to want to be insulin resistant. So by overriding that, could we actually potentially be making the situation worse? And again, that's that hierarchy of what we do first. We focus on the basics first, and then we test and investigate. And through our testing and investigation and symptomatic kind of like awareness, we then maybe look at particular treatment protocols that we can selectively use compounds that actually are going to support the area that's most crucial for them to be able to move forward and improve with glucose regulation. I hope that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. No, I think no, that was a really nice summary essentially, and I think that how we want to structure and prioritize it, I think is brilliant. And I think again everyone's going to agree with kind of that hierarchy of what are the strategies and interventions we want to be using. And the other thing is going back to what you mentioned around this kind of second layer of infections or inflammation, and how we might want to be particularly mindful if that second layer is appropriate for the individual based on what other symptoms are they struggling with. Because one way I guess we can look at this is the first layer, the condition of blood sugar dysregulation, if I just called it that, is a symptom. And therefore, if someone's got symptoms that are showing us that there is gastrointestinal imbalances, and if we run an, let's just say, a stool test and we find an infection or we find some gut inflammation, etc., then again, by supporting and rebalancing that, we're likely going to get improvement in the condition, which is again always just this label, really, that I think sometimes we can ultimately just ignore to a degree if we can do some testing to see, okay, where is this person's physiology out of whack and what do we need to do just to nudge it back into balance. And the main reason why I wanted to go back to what you mentioned there with the second layer is because I have a conversation quite a lot recently with clients around trusting their body. And what I mean by that is listening and being mindful about how it responds to what you are feeding it or how you're moving it, etc. Because there are people coming to me who are going onto a ketogenic diet before coming. Let's just say we run a stool test, see massive fat malabsorption, and we just say, look, you're not doing yourself any favors at this point in time doing such a high fat diet when actually you don't have the capacity to break down, absorb and utilize those fats. And it's probably similar from a blood sugar control perspective when we think of how personalized all of this can be.
Yeah, definitely. I think 100%. I think that ability to bring a level of awareness to what you're doing. Like with a lot of clients, I'll do like a food symptom emotions diary. So we're looking at kind of like their food intake, we're looking at their symptoms, but we're also looking at the emotions around food and that sort of thing as well. And just even if you did that as the starting point, even if you just had, before you made any significant changes with diet or lifestyle or anything like that, you just observe and you just see what's kind of going on with the body. And your body is going to give you clues as to what areas it needs to focus on. And and I think that's the joy, I guess, of what we do, that ability to sit with someone and really discuss their story and discuss their symptoms and to run through everything, is we start to see the areas that are jumping out. And it's those areas that are jumping out that we go, look, these are some areas that I think we need to work on first. Yes, you've got XYZ symptoms and this and that, and you've been labeled with da 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 da, but this looks like a really interesting area for us to explore. And did you know that that is also linked with da 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 and this and that? So you kind of start to pull that puzzle and pull the pieces together. And I think explaining and exploring and showing that kind of almost journey to them, that this is where we're going to start and we're not going to try and work on everything together at the same time. And I'm not looking for us to go in and treat a specific condition or symptom or anything like that. We just go, your symptoms are giving us clues of what's going on physiologically. Those clues are basically guiding me as to either what recommendations I'm going to give you or maybe what we need to test and explore to understand more about, why that might be happening. And then that allows me to then progress and move forward with my suggestions and recommendations. So, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that ability for people to tap into a level of self-awareness will ultimately help them move forward with what's going on, because they'll actually start to see things that they're doing that are influencing them in a certain way. And then it becomes an intrinsic motivation to change what they're doing. Rather than us telling them what to do, they experience and see how they're responding to certain things. And then it requires no willpower, which is amazing for us, because then they start making changes without us having to try and twist their arm or whatever it might be. So, yeah, I think the more we can get clients engaged in that process of being aware, the better it can be for everyone.
Yeah, and I think something I try and do a little bit more at the moment is kind of, I guess, inform a potential client that it is in a active process and that they have to be very much engaged. And, it's going to take time, effort, energy, and a little bit of money to get to where they may want to be. Because I think sometimes there is that little bit of mentality for some people to think that it's a passive process, that they just need to be told what to do and maybe get a test or have a protocol and then get better. And I think a real message that I want to kind of get out there is, that's not how we get better ultimately.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like, I used to do personal training, and it's like, you wouldn't go and see a personal trainer and have them write a year's worth of programs for you and then go off and like do it, or write one program for you, sorry, and go off and do that for the rest of your life.
Right, or either really.
Or either, really, yeah, because everything's changing all the time. And even with what we're doing, it's that ability to work with each other and to understand what's going on, and for us to kind of explore that process a little bit. And I'll be the first to sort of hold my hands up and say, definitely in the past, I've not sort of, reiterated it's a process of working together to be able to do that. And quite often people come in with the expectation that there's going to be this miracle consultation where I'm going to know all the answers and give them the exact protocol that's going to fix the symptoms that they've had for 30 years. It's just not possible, like it is so much more complex. Like, occasionally we'll get lucky and, we'll make a specific recommendations or changes, and we can get, phenomenal results sometimes with people, but they are much more the lesser of the consultations. Most of it is a process of working with people for sure, and it's over a more sustained period of time, months, even sometimes going into years, to be honest with you, with some clients I've worked with.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think it's really important to have that kind of, I'll use the word sort of signposting, what is a realistic expectation here.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Steve, this has been incredibly educational. I'm going to have to listen to this again myself, I think. So thank you very much.
I hope it makes sense when you play it back.
I'm sure it will. No, it's been fantastic. So thank you very much. I'm pretty sure this is going to be a very popular episode, and it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of feedback I think we get from it, because I think it's an area that we don't get as much training on as we should in our kind of diplomas or even degrees in nutrition. It's still kind of simplistically explained to the best of my knowledge anyway.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a really interesting kind of point, because it's an area that we know a lot about. And we've been learning about kind of like insulin since the 1920s, essentially, since it was first discovered. And there's been tons of research kind of through the 40s, 70s, like all of that, like relating to all of this. And I think what sometimes happens is that something a little bit more interesting comes along and takes the limelight. And, when you're talking about like the genome and microbiome and that sort of thing, and actually what can sometimes do is we get pulled towards those things. And there's not an issue with being pulled towards those things, because they're really important and they're going to influence the whole picture. But what we don't want to do is forget about what I think are some of the fundamental things. And one of those is most certainly blood glucose regulation and insulin regulation and glucagon and that sort of picture. If you're looking at things like cholesterol, PCOS, like, obviously metabolic syndrome and all of those sorts of things, and how they're related to our ability to manage glucose and insulin and other hormones, then I think we've got an area that if there are certain things if there are two areas that I would say are the most important for people to focus on, it's glucose regulation and digestive health, like 100%. I think if you can nail down those two areas, then with most people, you're going to see some improvements. Like glucose regulation, you can see phenomenal improvements in just someone's energy, just immediate. And if you get someone feeling more energetic and, more stable through the day, then their ability to then manage and cope with other recommendations that you're giving them will also improve as well at the same time. So I think what we don't want to do is we don't want to lose this kind of, almost this area where we have a lot of knowledge that has a really significant and almost immediate influence on how people feel.
That's a really good point. And it's a very wise point around, we get the new shiny ball of research and we all want to kind of jump onto that. But yeah, I would agree. I think digestive health and glycemic control are two absolute foundations. And as you say, you can get some really quick improvements. And what do a lot of, certainly my clients want? They want more energy so they can do the things that they want to do in life. So that's a really good point, I think. A good one to conclude on.
Cool.